Okay, so we're recording an interview. I'm Catherine Temple, and this is Matt Pavesich, a professor in the English department at Georgetown. And he's been working on some engaged and public humanities types of projects, and in particular, a project involving DC and political change in DC. So I thought it would be helpful to ask him some questions about that project. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, Matt, and then tell us about your project.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Matt Pavesich. I teach in the English department, as Catherine said, at Georgetown. I'm specifically in the writing program, and so my own field is in rhetoric and writing. I moved to DC about 9 years ago, and I moved from Chicago. Chicago's flag is a very distinctive flag. It has 4 stars and a couple of bars. And when I moved to DC, I noticed pretty quickly that, just like in Chicago, Washingtonians use the DC flag in all kinds of ways too. In my field of rhetoric, one of the subfields that I'm really interested in is how people use sort of various visual designs to make arguments. And I just see all over the city the fact that folks are using the DC flag to make all kinds of arguments. And so that's what led to the first stage of my project, which is a 6-year-long archive of visual and sort of graphic adaptations of the DC flag. It's called DCAdapters, as you know. And I would describe that more as a public humanities project than an engaged humanities project. I don't know if that distinction is used in the same way for, a lot of folks you guys might have been reading in class or elsewhere. But for me, over the 6 years when I was recording all these adaptations of DC's flag, and I was analyzing them and publishing about them in academic journals, the project was always public. It was on a website that anybody could go to visit. But I increasingly felt like I wasn't that engaged with the community in the act of making that project. And so that led me to this second project that you mentioned a second ago. I was sort of thinking for at least a year, or looking for opportunities or ideas or just ways to think about how to convert what felt like a relatively sort of, not passive exactly, but public, if not fully engaged project of DCAdapters, how to convert that into something that just was more energetic, was more live, more connected with members of the DC public. And so the Doris Sommer book, The Work of Art in the World, that I learned about through you and through the graduate certificate in Engaged in Public Humanities, offered a really, I thought, exciting model for how to think about.
Exciting to hear. I didn't realize that connection had been made. Great.
Yeah, she has this, I think, spectacular model. She calls it cultural acupuncture. She's adapting the idea from someone else before her. But she describes cultural acupuncture as a way of using art to sort of, in a fairly, I think, and her term is a really interesting one, to use art in public spaces as a way to make precise kinds of interventions, right? So I really like the precision of it. Public art is often described in really broad sort of aesthetic terms, to beautify urban space maybe, or to help people feel better about themselves in the city as they live in it and move through it. But Sommer's notion of cultural acupuncture, I think of as a much more sort of rhetorically attuned method. She has this great example, and I reference it in the video, Downloading Statehood, where she's citing the mayor of Bogota and his use of mimes as a way to get Colombians to drive and sort of walk as pedestrian in sort of safer ways, right? I mean, there was a policy problem that wasn't being solved by typical policy interventions, and the mayor was able to use art to actually affect real policy change. And so to me, I mean, I feel like what that does is that bridges this, what I felt sometimes as a gap between the way that some humanities scholars think about public humanities and the way that folks in my field, rhetoricians, the way that we talk about public humanities, right? On the one hand, I think folks in literature and history and the arts are often thinking about what art objects can do in public. And that has its own affordances, but also its own constraints. On the other hand, folks in my field, when we talk about public engagement, I think we're not usually talking about art objects. We're usually talking about sort of more technical, deliberative acts and methods that connect to our roots in rhetoric, right? So literacy programs, or ways to improve the quality and the nature of public debate about political campaigns, say. And so what I'm trying to do with Downloading Statehood is bring together the arts-focused methods and models of cultural acupuncture with a rhetorical sort of sensibility, a way that uses visual rhetoric, a way to think about how do we change political argumentation using arts in the ways that Summer suggests.
So I'm interested to hear this, because I would have thought that the original project where you were collecting the flags, and it seemed to me that a lot of people were interacting with that project by sending you evidence. I mean, that seemed like a very, not at all passive, but interactive with the public type of project, but it didn't feel like that to you. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's passive. I think I already expressed my discomfort, or the passive is not the right word. You're totally right. People engaged with me a bunch around DCAdapters. I think 3 years into the project, the Washington Post featured it in one of the Sunday issues, and in the span of 3 or 4 days, tens of thousands of people came to the website, and that generated this sort of really interesting and, for me, unanticipated kind of organically emerging crowdsourcing. People that I had never met, that I don't know, started sending me flag adaptations that they found. I certainly, that had always been the case.
A picture of their tattoo or something? Or
yeah, totally. Tattoos for sure. I mean, all kinds of stuff, Yeah, tattoos, absolutely. Those are the most personal and personally revealing versions. Yeah, but the interactions that I had with people, they were around the project, not around the issues in DC that people's flag adaptations were responding to. Like, if there are certain blocks on 14th Street Northwest or U Street Northwest and other places too, where you walk down the block, and on the one hand, it feels like a pop-up art gallery. There are, I mean, on some days, like literally scores of adapted flags, stickers, graffiti, political ads. And it feels like, on the one hand, it's like a little art gallery, like I said, but on the other hand, it feels like a visual debate that you're traversing. I mean, you're moving through all these different sort of images and arguments that are locked in agonistic relationships with each other, debates about gentrification, statehood, and so on. And so I didn't feel like the project, the DCAdapters site itself, was really engaging the public on those issues. It was engagement just on the phenomenon of flag adaptation, which I find interesting. But it's cool, right? But it's sort of niche, and it was still only obliquely connected to the important political issues that I wanted to sort of try to engage with. And so that's what, that desire and need is what gave birth to Downloading Statehood. I struggled to think about, it seemed clear to me that if I wanted to make a video that could be shared on social media platforms, it had to be short, it had to be engaging, it had to sort of blend storytelling and argumentation. And it was a hard choice, but it felt to me like I had to focus on one debate in DC. And so, I don't know, statehood feels to me like a pressing issue here in DC, but there's a bunch of others as well. Cultural displacement, racial displacement, gentrification, all kinds of other stuff too. But it seemed to me that there's such a, especially for folks who are outside of the District of Columbia, the statehood issue so clearly connects to the use of the image of the flag itself. And that's a big part of my intended audience. So I went with that issue.
No, that's so interesting. So for the website, you could have a kind of principle of outreach and inclusion, because you had endless amounts of real estate, really, for collecting all of that material. And then for the video, you suddenly are confined to, how long is the video? Like 7 minutes or something?
Not even, it's about 5, just over 5.
Right, which is about all you can expect anyone to ever watch, anyhow, as we know. So I guess the next question is, how did you deal? I mean, you had a vast amount of material, plus your own, not just pictures of the flag, but your own observations and scholarship and writing you had done about it. What was your principal selection for designing the video?
Mm. Yeah, there's a specific question there, but there's a broader one I think too. It's such a challenge to write and create something in a much smaller, tighter, in some ways less nuanced form than we're used to working in as scholars. Though I don't want to make that kind of value judgment. There's just less time to elaborate on arguments in a 5-minute video.
Yeah,
um,
Samuel Johnson once said, "I would have made it shorter, but I ran out of time." In other
yeah,
words, it can be much more difficult to express complex ideas in a shorter period of time or a shorter document
yeah.
than a longer document. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, so to answer your question a little more directly, one of the major challenges was that at first I felt like I started to try to tell the story of DC adapters as a project
Uh-huh.
at the start of the video as a way to sort of bring people in. And when you watch the video now, you'll notice I actually, if you pay attention, you'll see that I never actually named DC adapters even as a project.
Mhm.
It's not a part of the video itself. The goal of the video is not to bring people to DCAdapters.org or even
Mhm.
to send me submissions. The website's included at the very end of the video. But the story of the video is simply that I try to frame it as a mystery. I saw these adapted flags. It raised my curiosity. I'm trying to get people to think, because anecdotally over the years, whenever I've told someone about the project, they always say things like, "Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I guess I've seen those around the city." And then we'll keep talking for a minute or two. And that same person then will say, "Oh, wait, have you seen the one at like 7th Street in Rhode Island?"
Yeah.
Which suggests to me that these things like nestle into people's brains and memories. And so that's why I start with the sort of mystery as I do. What
Mhm.
are these flags? What are people doing with them?
Great. Yeah.
And we swing out to the idea of cultural acupuncture. For a minute, the video feels a bit like an academic essay. I'm sort of like citing Summers um, and her example from Bogota. But it's a way of queuing up the idea that a way that all of us in DC could intervene in one of the issues that seems most important to us is through the method that Summers offers us.
Mhm.
Right? So there's sort of three acts, I guess, to the 5-minute video. Um, and to zoom even in more specifically on your question, like how did I choose the specific images from the DC Adapters archive for the video? It was a negotiation with the filmmaker that I was working with. He had a really good sense of the images that would work visually the best in the video format. A lot of them, because I take these photos just as I move around the city. Frankly, a lot of the photographs are not great. I'm running
Yeah.
from
It's a
like,
collection. It's not. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's all kind of guerrilla style. I'm between like the grocery store and a bar, and I jump off my bike and I take a photo of a sticker on a street sign, and maybe the camera's shaking a little bit, or So he had a bunch that he really wanted to use. I chose a bunch that I thought kind of illustrated the spirit or the heart of the project in some ways. And I also really wanted viewers of the video, even if the video is not about DC adapters as the
Mhm.
project, I wanted people to get a sense of the range of the ways that people use the flag, a range of the purposes, but also the range of graphic adaptations and materials even that people use.
Mhm. So you chose items from the website, but you also chose, as you said, there were three acts, right? There's sort of setting up the mystery, and
Yeah.
then how would you categorize Act Two?
Yeah. So Act One is the mystery. It's what are these things? Why are people adapting the flag? Act Three is when we go to Bogota and look at the example of Mayor Antonis Marcos in Bogota,
Mhm.
and how he uses art to intervene in a public policy and a public health and safety issue. And
That's Act
Frank,
Two or Act Three?
that's Act Two, and that's sort
Okay.
of to show that that's successful and to connect it to cultural acupuncture from Summers' book.
Yeah.
Act Three jumps back to DC, where we
Mhm.
say, look, there's a lot of issues here, just like in Bogota. One of our most important issues is statehood. What if we used culture, like our own version of cultural acupuncture, just like Mayor Marcos in
Mhm.
DC? What could we use to generate sort of like a moment of cultural acupuncture to advocate for ourselves for statehood?
Right. Which gives a really nice feeling of both closure and like an upcoming next project
Yeah,
at the end.
yeah, totally.
Closed it up and you opened it up. So
Yeah,
Yeah, I just think it's a brilliant video. We watched it a few times, and but one thing I thought was especially compelling in it was you didn't divorce it from your scholarship.
Mm.
But as we all know, watching someone on a video sit around and write is not the most entertaining thing in the world. So there was especially one moment I liked where it shows you sitting with a pen and a piece of paper or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
as you're like contemplating deep thoughts or whatever. And but I thought that was such a, I mean, it was very short, but it really made the point that this was a project that's both
Mm.
scholarly and popular, you know, that has some
Yeah.
deep roots in your scholarly work as well as works on. And I just wondered, you know, how did you make that decision to include that kind of clip?
That's it's funny that you identify that moment. I spent a lot of time. So Mesbah Uden is the filmmaker that I worked with. He was an undergrad at Georgetown. He took my first year writing class. He eventually went to University College London and studied film. And he and I had some friendly but relatively tense conversations about essentially, like, I didn't want to include as much footage of myself. Um,
Uh-huh.
and specifically, I was not sure how useful or sort of in the right tone the footage was of, like, me in the classroom or me writing in my office.
Yeah.
You know, any scholar who thinks about working publicly and working with public audiences is, I think we're grappling with a bunch of different sort of perceptions around what it means to be an academic.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so, you know, I was I was eager and happy to include, like, a theoretical concept like cultural acupuncture. I think people are eager for big ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we need to avoid. I mean, we need to avoid, like, sort of overly jargonistic
Mm-hmm. But
language,
that's
but
like a wonderful little soundbite.
it's such an evocative term. I think it really communicates both a big idea, but also like and I'm using this word again really sort of intentionally, a precise sense of what it is and what it can do. And so I wanted to include a little bit of theory, just enough, right? And tell a story. And Mesbah was the one who was like, no, like, include the classroom footage, include the office footage.
Mhm.
It it I might have been overcompensating in my resistance to that, to my concern that folks, you know, I don't know, they're a little suspicious or skeptical of the academic who works publicly.
Well, I think that interwoven with the other material, you on your bike, for instance, you know,
Yeah,
was enough to, you know, I mean, it kind of
yeah,
humanized what academics do. So it did that kind of work for us as well, which I really appreciate a great deal.
yeah. No, I think Mesbah did a great job of offering a sort of a rounded sort of vision of what it means to do work like this. You know, you're in the office sometimes, you're out in the streets at other times,
Mhm.
you're working by yourself sometimes, you're working with other people sometimes.
Yeah, no,
And a lot of that credit goes to Mesbah, I would say, or at least our collaborative conversations.
well, I think that's a, you know, such a great benefit of collaborating with somebody who's not in your field and not
Yeah,
familiar with your jargon and, you know, is looking at it from an outside perspective. And that's the value in part that we get from working with Therese on that other project,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
You know, she says, this is just too long. No one's going to listen. You know?
That's right.
What does this mean? And how can we communicate this meaning? And I think the video really does communicate the importance of that kind of work.
Yeah,
Have you
yeah.
gotten what kind of responses have you gotten to the video as far as
Well,
early days?
yeah, I mean, so far it's been up for just a couple of weeks. I've got a sort of a multi-stage circulation strategy that I'm.
Hey, yay, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that sounds maybe more thoughtful than perhaps what I'm actually doing is. But so, you know, I first just shared it with, like, friends and my personal networks on social media and over email. I shared it with my sort of, like, academic professional networks.
Mhm.
Um, So those are the first two layers of the circulation strategy. And then, you know, over the years with DCAdapters, I've sort of made a variety of contacts in the city.
Mhm.
So people at the DC Public Library, communications directors for a couple of city council members,
Mhm.
people at, like, the Washington Historical Society, where I published something about DCAdapters,
Mhm.
folks who were sort of in and around the municipal and the Washington sort of cultural scene. And so I shared it with those folks next. And now I'm sort of entering just now, really as of like yesterday, the sort of more intentional, or a little more carefully intentional layer of the circulation strategy. I'm reaching out to folks who I see as strategically located in some of this DC statehood organizations, to sort of see if they're interested in collaborating on perhaps op-eds that would sort of cite and also try to encourage some of the action that I'm referencing in downloading statehood. I've also reached out to, there's a couple of graduates from Georgetown who eventually started a project called FM 31, Field Manual 31. It's like a social enterprise. They make notebooks. They have adapted flags on their notebooks.
I think who is the person who started that?
Well, Noah Martin and Jesse Flores.
Jesse Flores, I know.
Yeah. So I just reached.
Beautiful. Those are just beautiful. Yeah.
They're great. Yeah. And so I've known those guys for a few, I mean, I think since Noah was a sophomore, maybe since Jesse was a junior. And basically I pitched to them the possibility of what would it look like to have like a DCAdapters and FM31 collaboration where, so this will take a short digression to loop back around, but Candy Chang is a wonderful artist who has a project that she called I Wish This Was. She was working in New Orleans post-Katrina. And you can look this up very easily online. It's a great project to share with students and other people. But what I Wish This Was essentially was that she created a bunch of stickers in the style of the Hello, My Name Is stickers, but instead on top they said, I wish this was. And she both distributed the stickers like in huge quantities across the city, sometimes just to people loosely. But then she also would just take a bunch and stick them all over walls in places all over the city. And people filled them out with all kinds of things. It's a fascinating, I think her project is a fascinating invitation to public dialogue around development and recovery from Katrina. And so what I've been thinking is like, how can I, the end of the downloading statehood video offers a sort of, it's a broad call to people in DC to adapt the flag so that like as much as we can in as many public spaces in DC as we can, on the theory that tourists who come here and people who commute here, and eventually with legislators, right, who have the power to grant us statehood, sort of have their visual field infiltrated basically by arguments for statehood. Washingtonians, of course, we can't make statehood happen for ourselves. It has to come from legislators elsewhere. And for that to change, they have to believe that their own constituents want them to vote for statehood for us. And so the video ends with that call, but I've been thinking, what can I do that would more actively encourage people to, as I say in the video, fill the visual field with adapted flags calling for statehood. So on the model of Candy Chang's I Wish This Was, I'm like, what if Jesse and Noah from FM31 and I create a series of like stickers, right, that maybe have the flag on it in some fashion. And maybe it's, the text on top is something like, I want statehood because, or something like that, right? And so maybe we put them in all the notebooks they sell, but then also we're at like the farmers markets and all the holiday markets that start to happen in like the next month or so here in DC. And just, make it happen. Make it
FM31 reminds me of one of the issues that one of my students raised, and then a couple others agreed, that they just couldn't get their head around the idea of 51 states. And what would it do if, and stuff like that. And I'm sure you've heard that before, but what if your sticker somehow made 51 the cool number?
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. Absolutely.
Like a stodgy old-fashioned number, but let's go for that sexy 51,
Asymmetry is cool, right?
Right, exactly.
I don't know if you've ever seen, so Mesbah and I included a short clip of John Oliver's longer story about DC statehood from his show Last Week Tonight. Later in that, it's like a 17-minute clip. And if you know John Oliver's sort of show, he's got a really very distinctive style of argumentation with comedy, obviously. He's always well-researched. But towards the end of his segment, he said something similar to what you just said, right? Which is that like, but people object, like, where are we gonna put a 51st star on the American flag and so on and so forth.
Oh, really big.
Well, but then he reveals that every time in his segment he'd showed the American flag, he'd had people in his production studio add a 51st flag to the flag.
That's
so
awesome.
so the point, of course, is that nobody noticed, right? No one noticed. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of like, I mean, using both sort of direct, rational, evidence-based argumentation in combination with what I sometimes refer to as like oblique methods of persuasion, pathos-driven storytelling, emotion-driven sort of styles of argumentation.
Right, right. So, okay, this is just really fascinating, and I could talk about it all day, but I did want to take this opportunity to switch gears a little bit and ask you if you have some advice for my students who are working on, they're not going to do actual public humanities projects or engaged humanities projects because it's just a one semester course, but they're working on proposals for projects that could be pursued in some larger context, for instance, for the English majors, perhaps as a senior honors thesis or something like that. And, as you know, you've done a lot of this. I've done very little of this. So I'm wondering, like, what kind of advice do you have for them that we can carry back?
I think that, so, I as you know, I work with faculty on translating scholarship into sort of public venues. I work with grad students and undergrads. And I think like all of us, I mean, including undergraduates, especially as they move into and through the major, we all develop a degree of expertise on really specific sort of subtopical areas of exploration and investigation. And it seems to me that if you find something that you really love, if you find it fascinating, and if you believe that other people have good reason to find it both important and fascinating, that's enough to sort of fuel like a traditionally academic sort of project. And then the question is that when you have a project of some sort, one that has sustained interest from you and from others, the question is who else besides your scholarly peers needs to know about what you've discovered? Whose life would benefit from the dissemination of that information, the taking seriously of that information, your findings, and the need to sort of build it into maybe new policies, ways of being with each other, cultural forms. So it's a simple question: who needs to know? And essentially, it's a question about rhetoric. It's a rhetorical question. It's a question of identifying audience. And once you identify an audience that would have a motivation to be interested, then the other questions they fall like dominoes. It's not that they're not complex, but they're much more easily tackled. If you know who your audience is and why they would care, then you can ask yourself, well, if my audience is X, how do I get in front of their eyes? And how do I do so in forms that they're eager for, ready to consume, that fit the kind of media that those folks tend to consume. So, and then, at this, as I get a little bit older and sort of move throughout my career, what I'm about to say, it changes nature over like every 5 years or so. But like, I don't know, I think it's important to try and do something that you think is cool and that you think that other people will think is cool, Now, granted, in my like early to mid 40s, what I think is cool is different from like maybe the 20-year-olds. But it connects to a rhetorical concept. The term is kairos, not the religious retreats that people go on, but a rhetorical technique of kairos, right? Which is about the sort of the window or the moment of opportunity. When are people paying attention? What kinds of things are they paying attention to? What's the zeitgeist? What's the thing of the moment? And the DC flag, DC statehood, this is the thing of the moment. People here are interested, they're interested in talking about it. One of the results of, gentrification is one of the sort of problematic outcomes of the influx that the Obama administration, I think, of new populations, of new people interested in coming to DC, of DC having a new kind of cool that it maybe didn't have before. even the restaurant culture has changed, right? DC is just a very different, I mean, in all kinds of problematic ways, but also in good ways, a different sort of city than it was before. And all these new residents, you know, they want to identify themselves as Washingtonians, as residents of the district, and the flag is one of the ways to do that. And so that's a built-in audience, you know, and so.
And it's all, I mean, it's interesting because it's a positive force for change, because those are folks who are identifying with DC in a very positive.
Yep.
I want to advertise my coolness through my attachment to DC.
Yeah.
And also who possibly have more power and economic resources than past populations. So, you know, maybe a little bit, you know, are a little bit more able to get something moving.
Yeah. You know, there's one more thing that I would add to that list too, right? So it's like, try and do something that's timely, identify an audience, figure out how you want to get, like what the best sort of genres or modes or media are to get in front of those folks. Try and do something cool. I mean, that's just another way of, that's like a flip way of saying, think about the aesthetics.
Right.
But, oh gosh, I just forgot the last thing I was going to say.
Was this one more? I'll have to say something boring so you can.
Damn, I can't believe I just lost it.
That's okay. I was, while you were speaking, I was thinking about the different genres that my students have been talking about. So everything from game. Oh, there we go. Okay.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? Yeah.
Do it.
It's so many of us who come up in the humanities think of critique as our primary mode of engagement.
Right.
And the critical is immensely important. But I think in public humanities, the critical is rarely sufficient. It's rarely sufficient to making a genuine impact. I think we need to think about moving beyond critique into modes of making, right? Take your critique and bake it into something that you can advocate for.
Right.
That's
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really crucial. And the critique, you know, we all know about the circularity of critique, right? Especially someone like myself who's been involved with academics since 1987.
Yeah.
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 My graduate program, and critique upon critique upon critique.
Yeah.
Do something with it. Yeah. So just one last question is about the genre of some of these projects. And my students have been talking about games, videos, websites, Instagram campaigns. One student did a Twitter campaign last summer when they did the certificate.
Yeah.
Are we pretty much covering it, or do you see other areas? I mean, of course, there are the traditional things like reading groups in the public sphere, or children's plays and things like that. But is there something we're not seeing here?
I think there is sometimes, yeah. So there's a whole list of genres that we could create, right? And you named a bunch of those genres. What are the sort of modes of writing that people are engaging in?
Technologies we can use. Right?
Absolutely.
They exercise different genres, maybe.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a productive list to make. I think we do. So there's a whole other category of events, right? And there's a whole host of different sorts of events that one might engage in. Maker sessions, of course. Like, I mean, I think one of the first times you and I talked about public humanities, you sort of the phrase you used was like, there's the Shakespeare in the Park model, right? And
I have to say that.
I mean, right. I mean, and I think, you know, the way that I heard it, at least, was both affectionate and a little bit self-deprecating about the sort of the limits in some ways of the imagination for events in the humanities, for what we can do. But there's all kinds of events. And I think
maker events.
Absolutely. I think that sometimes we don't, I mean, this is more on the sort of traditionally rhetorical than perhaps the humanities side of things, but you know, rhetoricians, we often think of ourselves as like bringing people together, like identifying strategic partners who can make something happen that's greater than what I could affect myself. And so, like, you have to engage in argumentation and persuasion to bring together organizations to make something happen. Jeff Grable, in a wonderful article called The Work of Rhetoric and the Commonplaces, tells a story about a woman named Elena who I think was a graduate student at the time, and she wanted to work with, I think it was a water rights advocacy group in her neighborhood. And she approached them to suggest that she might help them to sort of write, op-eds to help their cause. And the group sort of said, yeah, sure, that sounds good. And then they wanted her also to like create a website and make pamphlets. These are all the sort of expected genres that one might work in. It became clear to her really quickly, as Grable tells the story in his article, that all that stuff was actually farther down the road than where the group was. They needed help organizing information, bringing people together, creating surveys, right? So like gathering information with an eye towards how to use it later on, I think we need to describe as work in the public and engaged humanities too.
Interesting.
So.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that really opens things up for us, and
Yep.
and will be really helpful to the students and possibly to a larger audience too. So